as we all frantically click the leave meeting button.
All right, welcome to the Gateway API Code Jam. We're doing something a little different than the normal like pairing sessions that we do today. This meeting is under the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which basically boils down to be nice to one another. So please be nice to one another. We're just kind of going to do I don't really know how this is going to go exactly, except that the point was there's a couple people that have reached out to me with like, I really would love to get into the Gateway API, but I don't really know where to start. So let's just talk about it. So it's just going to be talking about it, probably a little bit of code diving, going through the website, very light, but meant to be kind of, lighthearted, fun. Interrupt me anytime. Questions are probably going to be the most important part of this little session. Just talking through questions and stuff like that. Yeah, so let's go. I'll start just by going to the website, actually, I think. Again, I am doing this like there's no script. So I really do want audience participation to kind of drive. So please do. You guys see the website?
Yep.
Yeah, that looks so weird in dark mode.
Yeah, I can undark mode it. Hang on. There we go.
It's no need,
Whatever.
but that does look a lot less weird.
Yeah. So I don't really need to go like read this word for word or anything. But I would say if you haven't just gone to the website, which you can find from the repository. So if you've made it to the Gateway API repository, it's right here under About. It gives a pretty good overview. I'm sure we could tweak it, and I'm sure parts of it might be a little bit out of date, but pretty good overview of what we're trying to do with Gateway API.
And somewhere in here, I think there is spelled out an answer to Obvious question, right? Of the difference between an ingress and this.
I think we had something somewhere. I know I've done talks on it. So actually there's a talk from KubeCon Detroit that was basically exactly that. And so we can cover a little bit of it, but I think I'll just, Abisman, I would be happy to also share a YouTube link to a talk that like specifically focuses in on what you're asking, like how does this compare to Ingress? But we'll do a high level. So Ingress was this one resource, although technically there was Ingress class later. Ingress class would basically kind of give you an idea of like, okay, this is my controller for my ingresses. So you could have multiple controllers in a cluster and so forth. If you're not sure what I just said, don't worry too much. Just come along for the ride a little bit. But basically one resource that could define some really simple like HTTP routing rules so that you could get traffic to your pods. You could use a service as the backend, service being the Kubernetes service. It had several problems, and this is where I feel like I'm almost going to recite the talk I did with Rob at Detroit, but it had several problems which ultimately resulted in Gateway API, which is kind of the follow-up, if you will, to Ingress. It is role-oriented in that we, instead of having like the connection to the directest connection to Ingress is actually HTTP route, which is an API, which we'll go over it in just a second. We'll talk about like the individual APIs. But basically the idea is you have routes and you have gateways, and you attach your routes to a gateway. And this gives you different roles. So like you have an infrastructure provider making the class, which says, here's the operator or controller. Here's the software that's responsible for handling the gateways. The gateway, which the cluster operator creates to say, I need a gateway. I'm going to attach routes to it, please. And then application developers can ship their routes with their applications and say, this is how you do things for my application. Does that all make sense? Any questions about that? Was that too much at once or anything?
No, it made sense. Thanks.
One thing I wanted to clarify based on what you just said, Shane, is that the Gateway API is the one that's role-oriented, and the Ingress, the old Ingress resource and APIs around it failed miserably in understanding that there were multiple roles involved. The other one that's probably worth pointing out is that especially in smaller organizations, people may not fall neatly into just one of the roles, right? So you may have people spanning roles, you may have people only in one role, but it all works out. The roles are still useful to think about anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Ingress, I mean, failed miserably is a little harsh, but it wasn't aware, certainly, about the roles. And now we are, and we've had some pretty good success with things like what you see here. So I guess I'll go into
if you look at me personally, you'll probably recognize a strong anti-Ingress resource bias that's been there since at least 2017. So I make no particular apologies about that.
Yeah. So
gonna-
just
I'm gonna
to
bring
give a
up
little go
I'm
ahead.
gonna
Sure.
bring up, I'm gonna bring up a hot topic, but it's interesting what role comes under policy attachments.
Can we
Yeah,
defer
that
that
is-
for a week
yeah,
or
that's
two,
gonna
please?
take up the whole
Yeah.
meeting.
Yeah. There's
Dang it,
so there's a
Lior.
lot of backstory here. It is an excellent question. I'm really hoping we'll have some constructive ways we can talk about that soon now, but
Different
yeah,
session.
that's a different session.
Yeah,
I think that would be a great session to have, though, you know?
That
Yeah.
for people who are really new, which there's at least a few in here, this would confuse everything so much. So please, we do have a thing called policy attachment that's experimental. Please don't worry about it yet.
Please don't worry about it yet.
Yeah, please don't worry about it yet. So anyway, I figured it might be a little bit helpful to talk about like projects that I work on. I won't go into depth about them, but like, for instance, I work on something called the Kong Gateway Operator, which is not open source at the moment, but we're intending for it to be. So I could, at some point, I'll be able to show it to people. But it basically was built with only Gateway API in mind. So it was kind of a post Gateway API operator. Whereas before we had our Kong Kubernetes ingress controller. Both of them have support for Gateway API.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you please repeat what you just said?
Yeah, sorry.
My
So
net's lagging
I
a
have
bit.
two implementations. There's a few implementations of Gateway API where I work. There are two that kind of help me to express what I'm trying to express in terms of like what the Gateway API can do for implementers. And that's the really important thing, especially if you're coming into this wondering how I can contribute. We'll get to like implementations are really important to that. So I have two implementations that I've worked on very directly. And one of them is the Kong Gateway Operator built after Gateway API, meaning it only does Gateway API. And it literally provisions gateways, as in proxies, if you want to call them that, in response to a gateway resource being created. Does that make sense? So my point here is to try to re-emphasize the role orientation, because I work on a project where we have something where there's literally, like this kind of a breakdown of like infrastructure cluster and application developer fit perfectly into our model for our customers. And we have different people deploying the gateway, then the routes that attach to it, and so forth. But in addition to just, this is to try to help just make it more clear why we have these rule orientation. Like we literally have something that just handles gateways in our code, right? Just works on like, let me deploy my gateway with these settings and stuff like that. And another thing, another controller, if you will, which is just a fancy word for saying another loop that's sitting there working on other things, is focusing on the route part and attaching them to the gateways. So programming the data plane. So the gateway is the data plane, and we're programming it with the routes that we create. Hopefully I'm not overcomplicating things by pointing out like this extra distinction.
It makes sense, sort of.
But it works really well for us because it basically, the model filled right over what we were already doing with our customers. So that is kind of part of what you get at a very high level compared to Ingress. Whereas with Ingress, you would have in our stuff, we would have originally like the Helm deployment of the proxy. We still do. There's the Helm deployment of the proxy. You manage everything by hand. The life cycle of the gateway is managed entirely by the person, the human operator. Whereas having these APIs as APIs, like having these distinctions and these roles, makes it easier to model Kubernetes operators, that is autopilots for handling these components and their life cycle, that is from the point where they're created to all the things that they're configured with, to when they have bad days and good days, all managed at least in part by some autopilot software. Does that all?
Okay, if you're writing a controller that has bad days, please remove the bad day code.
Bad days, like when I said bad, yeah, that's funny. No, when I said bad days, I was thinking more like it's there for the ride when things like, the traffic gets so heavy for the data plane that it goes down. Your autopilot system using these APIs may be capable of healing that and stuff like that.
Right.
These are the kind of things I work on downstream.
There's also I think it's a little bit important to lean on the fact that if you're used to the Ingress resource, you are probably also accustomed to a world where the human installs an Ingress controller, and then you go through and configure Ingress resources to make things happen, et cetera, et cetera. one of the big distinctions between the two, between the Ingress API and the Gateway API, is that what will generally happen with the Gateway API is that you configure a gateway resource, and that causes the Ingress controller code to come into being for you, which
Yeah, it's another
is
good
a
way to
little,
put it.
yeah, it's a little different in terms of some of the focus of things, and it can understanding that that's there can help understand some of the complexities when you look at some of the code. Gateway API is for north-south traffic. East-west traffic might be handled by kube proxy, or it might be handled by a service mesh, or it might be handled by, you know, a variety of other things. But the distinction that the Gateway API was originally for north-south, not east-west, is important. And then we have to talk about Gamma, where people are trying to figure out how to make the Gateway API also be able to configure east-west traffic. But that also is probably
People like who, Flynn?
the two of us, for example. Yeah. And
So
yes,
yes,
it is a big mess, you know.
actually, it's in here. If you are interested more in like mesh traffic, east-west traffic, there is a page for Gamma. I don't think we're going to dive too deep into that, but basically, it's an experimental sub project of the Gateway API project to use things like HTTP route east and west inside the cluster between applications, as opposed to ingress into the application from outside the cluster. We just said a lot. Questions?
Yeah, I had one question. So is so is the Gateway API built? So from what I can understand is that the Gateway API works separately from the ingress, not built on top of the ingress.
Correct. It's built on it's built like in spirit on ingress. Like a lot of some of the same people were involved and stuff like that. It's those of us that did ingress for many years built Gateway API. It is you'll find this in I'll send you a link to Rob and my talk from Detroit, but basically we are at a point where ingress is not going to get any new features. All the new features will go to Gateway API, and that means Gateway HTTP route to the APIs within the Gateway API project. So I think that's just it's in that way it's kind of its successor. But yeah. Anyway, good question. Okay.
Gateway also supports L4 load balancing or L4
Yeah,
not.
let's get into that. I think that's in concepts.
I also have a question. Like, what's the once we come to 1.0? So do we encourage people to start using it for production stuff? Because
yeah, I mean they already are, but yes,
I'd encourage people to start using it for production now if it meets their needs.
Yeah, I mean we have plenty of people using it in production. I mean I know for a fact Google does, and so what V1, which we're hoping for to do for KubeCon Chicago, so we're hoping to do it in October before November, should be is just, well, back to the overview actually, just the parts you see here, gateway class, gateway, and HTTP route as GA, meaning backwards compatibility will be preserved. We are ready. We are saying this is usable in production now. But as Daman was pointing out, there is more than just HTTP routes. So the gateway is what you attach routes to, but we have routes of type HTTP route, TLS route, TCP and UDP route. We have a gRPC route now that's actually moving along pretty quickly. And the sky's the limit. We could add more in the future if the need shows up, but this is pretty good coverage of a lot of what people are doing in a Kubernetes network today. So that's all there. The things that are not HTTP route on this table are mostly in alpha. I think they're all in alpha state and like on their way to beta, whereas HTTP route is in beta and on its way to GA. It's the main use case. It's the most used route. So it's kind of driven forward. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question, Naman?
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
You, Shane, does HTTP route already cover HTTP 3 or not? Do you remember?
I don't think so.
I don't think it does. I think that's still to come.
Yeah, I think that is for the future.
Yeah.
Let's see. Probably be good to just look at some stuff real quick. Let's like look at these actual APIs. So like here's some examples. A gateway class is a very simple resource. And Yeah, let's go into breaking it down, but do stop me if there's like things you want to focus on. So we talked about all the rules and we talked about the APIs by name. Let's just look at them real quick and then we'll kind of move on. Gateway class is pretty much just a controller. It's most of them are this simple, although there are a couple other fields you can fill in. This is just a resource that's cluster scoped that kind of says this is my controller by name. So like example.net, my gateway controller that's responsible for gateways attached to this. And then I don't care about all this stuff right now. Oh, sorry, gateway. So then a gateway, why don't we have examples in here? Where's all the examples? Simple gateway, here we go. Okay, so a gateway then attaches to that gateway class that we looked at and says, okay, for the controller that's responsible for me, here is a gateway I need you to provision for me, if you will. And I need it to have these listeners, which in this case is just a basic HTTP port 80 listener. It needs to be listening on that port. Does that make sense? So now we're at the point where Ingress used to kind of step in. Like Ingress couldn't do any of this. And we can go down to the route level. So an HTTP route then can attach as the gateway attached to the gateway class to say this is the controller responsible for me. The HTTP route attaches to the gateway to say this is where the data plane where my configuration needs to be pushed to, if you will. And this one says, okay, for that gateway, I'll take this host name. Anything from this host name needs to go to port 80 and to this service. That's a Kubernetes service. And here's where some things kind of get interesting. So there's a lot more. I don't think we necessarily need to dive into it right here, but we can if there's questions. But there's a lot more rules than Ingress had. A lot of different ways in which you can kind of shape your traffic and get things to like certain backends, which you should dive into in the documentation, in the API and stuff like that if you're interested. There's also obviously this attachment to the actual gateway, which is new. So that's very different from HTTP route. But in that video I'll send you, Abhishman, there's basically a one-to-one comparison that comes up in terms of Ingress versus HTTP route. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so just a quick one really, I suppose. We have parent refs and backend refs. Are they ever going to be anything other than a gateway reference and a service reference?
Maybe. I mean, the idea is that we learned lessons about, like, for instance, with Ingress, you pretty much just point that as a service, right? There are potentially use cases out there for pointing it at something else, and it's really better for us to leave that open-ended so that people can have implementations that aren't like somehow locked into service if there's some other thing that they want to point at. One thing that concretely for a backend ref for HTTP route is done today is service imports. So if you're doing multi-cluster services, and we actually have documentation on this in this website. I won't get into this too much because again, kind of like net policy attachment, multi-cluster services is like way too much for what we're trying to do here. But if you have multiple clusters, service imports basically collect all the backends across those clusters, and you can point an HTTP route at that. And we have documentation which says how to do that. And it's pretty much the same thing as service, but with a service import. So yes. And one concrete example.
We also have the concrete example that although this is not yet part of the standard, the Gamma initiative is allowing a parent ref to be a service as well. So
right. Yeah.
These are both things that can evolve over time and that we expect to evolve over time.
Yeah. The flexibility is very intentional.
Do we program our Nginx or we have a custom load balancer for that? Like, how do we do that?
Great question. So your question is basically like what's under the hood here?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
There's lots of options. Let's go.
I hope it's not eBPF.
What's that?
I hope it's not eBPF.
There are ways you could use eBPF with the
I'm
Gateway
doing
API, but nothing about the Gateway API requires eBPF.
He said, "Where's the page? Somebody help me. Where's the page?" He said, "I hope there's not eBPF," and it's funny because like I'm working on one of those. So okay, here's all the things that might be behind it. So these are the implementations. We have a lot. We have like 20 plus implementations. We have a couple of integrations that are notable as well. But basically, here's us, Kong, where I work. We're doing 2 different implementations. We do one that does Open Resty, which is, if you don't know it, it's basically a wrapper around Nginx. And then we have another one that does Envoy, which is a very popular proxy as well. And for any of these, like HA proxy, Google does, I think their implementation is over their network load balancers in the cloud provider, and so forth. So it can really be, it's abstract, so that you can really have
Or it's
anything you
just the
want underneath
interface
it.
and provider can implement it.
Yeah, you can have anything you want underneath it. And we have, to help make this work, we have a model of conformance support levels. I'm so glad I was able to find the page right when I was thinking of this. But basically, for those 20 plus implementations, it might feel kind of hard. Like, how do all of these implement the same API? We created leveled, tiered support, if you will. Tiered is probably not the right actual word, but it's kind of like that, in that core is every implementation can do this. Every implementation can listen on port 80 and take basic HTTP route traffic with like a host name of foo.com or whatever. Right?
And in fact,
everyone
every
can do that.
implementation is required to be able to do that.
That's
if
actually
it's in the
exactly the
core.
next, that was the exact next thing I was going to go to. There are
Oh,
tests.
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. Like I said, I want audience participation, for sure. There are tests that test this so that you can say, I am conformant. And we're working on more stuff related to this testing, which is probably not worth talking about too much here unless you have questions about it. Basically, core is everything can do it. Extended is some can do it. And implementation specific is we are aware that people have something they want to do here. We don't really have any tests or anything for it. We just have it here for awareness. And maybe one day it graduates to extended if a few people are able to do it and we can start coming up with some tests for it. And along this path, basically from bottom to top, things can graduate. We can get to a point where somebody something implementation specific theoretically can go to extended, like I said. And in theory, if we get to a point where every implementation checks in and says, okay, this one extended feature, we can all do it now, that could become core. Might take time, but these things, we left it open so that that could happen. And we actually, like I said, I won't dive into it too deep, but we have upcoming work right before GA that I'm working on with a couple other people in the community called conformance profiles, which will help to identify these things better and report these. There'll be an actual reporting system where you send reports back to us, and then we have an index, if you will, of who's actually doing what that we can search, whereas currently we query Slack for that today, and it sucks. So
Very advanced.
the very
Dan
advanced
had-
Slack query method.
Dan had
Go
a
ahead.
question on Slack that ties in pretty directly to the conformance profile work. Sorry, question on chat, Zoom chat, not Slack, that ties pretty directly into the conformance profiles about the L4 project trying to pick up Gateway API. At some point, if we see a lot of interest in that, I would expect that we would end up with a layer 4 conformance profile for exactly the reason you just said.
I'm
It's
working on
not
it.
possible for an L4 gateway to support HTTP route. So if enough people want to do that, we would need to do a profile that says you're conformant with the L4 profile if you do TCP route and UDP route and nothing else.
Yeah.
Meshes have a similar problem where asking a mesh to support the full ingress role doesn't really work out. And so there's a mesh conformance profile that's under active development to make that sort of distinction work.
Roger that. And I have a whole bit I was hoping to get to before the end of this that relates to L4 and a project that that I'm working on, but a couple of us in the community are working on that should fit right into your question, Dan, but I think you already know it. We can talk about that if we have time for that, because L4 has been a big important thing for me. And I currently have a branch where I'm working on the initial conformance tests for TCP route and UDP route. There have just been so many competing priorities that have been so much higher priorities that branch has been sitting for a little bit. But
everything's priority 0.
Well, in the face of what's going on with Gateway API today, with layer 7 being the only thing going to GA, layer 7 stuff gets the higher priority generally. But the work will be done. It's underway, and we'll get to that point. Hopefully, I didn't make that too complicated. Does that make sense that we have many implementations? We have different levels of support for like the fields. If I wasn't clear about that, like in HTTP route, there are fields that are core. Every implementation can do it. There are fields that are extended. You may deploy an implementation, like let's say Kong, for instance, where like it may not support that. And so it's marked as such, like, just so you know, this may not be supported in every implementation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Moving right along. We've talked for a half hour and kind of just gone over like topical, kind of important topical stuff for Gateway API. Are there any, let's stop for questions. You got any questions? Like, do you have any directions you kind of want to go from here? If not, I can keep going, but.
But the code base is like only like, the gateway API code base is like CRDs, clients, and like version API, right? And all other stuff for the implementation.
Tests.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good segue. So we just talked about all these implementations and that they all use these APIs. So let's talk about the APIs. Our repository is mostly what Leor just said. Like, it's mostly just the APIs. Like, we don't have an implementation in this repository. If that wasn't clear before, we only have what we'll call third-party implementations, but there's one caveat, which is the thing I potentially want to get to if we have time. So let's look at HTTP route types, for instance. This is pretty indicative of what you'll find in the code base. The API for HTTP route, the specification. We just looked at one that had, what was it, host name, right? So like, here's the host names field that we were just looking at where it said example.com. The rules. So it's pretty much that. An HTTP route is pretty much the common route spec, parent ref, like what gateway are you putting this route on? Host names and rules. So this is a lot of what the code base is, and that's what you'll find under and I guess we can just go right into code diving because I think that's what you wanted originally, Damon. That's what you'll find in APIs, is the actual APIs that eventually become those YAML declarations of HTTP route and gateway and TCP route and all that you saw. This one is,
for that.
What's that?
Like, do we use Kube Builder for that? Maintaining versions and all that?
Yeah. We use Kube Builder and we use Kube Builder's, I love their annotations for like validation and stuff like that. It's really helpful. Admission is just our admission webhook. That one's kind of squirrely. If you want to get in there and dig into that, we'd appreciate it. Config is our actual like CRDs and YAML basically that you can actually deploy. This might get a little confusing because I just talked about conformance levels, but we also have, actually, I think it's on this page. One sec. Somewhere in here, I think we talk about release channels. We also have release channels. So all these support levels are things that like these are supported things at these levels. Release channels is how we get a standard channel of like, these are the standard CRDs versus how we are able to kind of like host some experimental things. You can have things in an experimental release channel at any of these levels or a standard release channel at any of these levels technically. But experimental is basically where the newer things we're not sure are going to continue on go. And in the code base, you'll see that here because this is where we emit our experimental CRDs with the extra fields that are experimental versus standard. And generally speaking, in production, people are using these ones, the standard ones. And you'll see there's a lot less of them here because things like TCP route and UDP route, because they're alpha, are considered experimental today. That will probably be changing in the next few months. Sorry, next few months is probably pushing it a little bit, but it should be changing relatively soon after GA. Okay. Hopefully that was clear. So basically you'll find our CRDs in here and technically our webhook YAML for deploying it.
Shane.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask is, like, theoretically, if something goes from experimental to standard, so wouldn't it be reasonable to say, like, wouldn't it be reasonable to say that it must be, like, it should be extended or core? Like, why would something be implementation specific and be standard?
Yeah. So implementation specific is kind of special in that it's just a level that exists to point out that something may exist. And we do occasionally, I think we have a couple of fields for that, but it's kind of like no man's land, more or less. But if it's in standard and implementation specific, That means it's something we're aware of, people can do, and we're comfortable enough with it that we know that it's just part of the package. Like it should be part of the package. It's not an experiment. People are doing it. We just don't have conformance tests for it yet, or can't conformance test it for some reason.
I actually have an
but
example of something that might
but-
land in that.
Go ahead, go
didn't-
for it. I need water.
I didn't realize that like the only thing that stopped us from moving it from implementation specific to extended is a conformance test. Like I thought implementation specific is
More
actually
or
like,
less.
Pretty much, yeah. If
If
you
you
can write a conformance test for it, it implies that everybody
extended.
is capable of doing it in the same way, so it can be extended. But a
I
good
see.
example of this one is timeouts, our perennial example of something that should be simple
Yeah.
and is not, where if you go look over the existing implementations of the Gateway API, you will find that there isn't a single timeout that all of them actually agree on in terms of where it begins and where it ends. So writing a conformance test for that, there's a timeouts enhancement proposal now that I personally think is pretty good. But it acknowledges the fact that, yeah, there's going to be some variation between implementations, which is okay in this particular case. You can still use timeouts in a meaningful fashion, even if trying to go through and write a conformance test that requires multiple implementations to be the same down to the millisecond is really hard.
Right.
Yeah.
And people are doing timeouts in production. So, it's not really experimental. It's standard. It's part of the package. We just can't test it yet. Although,
I mean,
yeah,
you could
great
ask
example.
you could ask for a timeout, input. Like you could get a timeout. But yeah, like I recall I think the HTTP pass as well was implementation specific, but there are some conformance tests that I written and they are implementation specific. So I didn't understand this like
We can probably get there. We may be able to graduate that up then.
Yeah.
It would probably be when we have 2 people at least doing it.
I mean, you're
and some
just
soak
talking
time.
about HTTP path-based routing, or are you talking about something
Redirect.
different?
Path redirect.
kinda-
Yeah. I'm
Oh,
trying
path redirect. Okay.
trying to check
Yeah.
for it. Yeah, you can go ahead. I'll ping it later.
Yeah, sounds good. No, good points. Thank you for bringing that up. That one, that if it has, it has tests, you're right. So it's like in a weird spot, and we can probably start thinking about moving it forward.
I mean, path
Um,
redirect seems like something that people ought to generally agree on. So that certainly
yeah.
seems like something we should be able to graduate.
Yeah.
Or
We
at
have
least
tests for it.
move
So
forward.
we just need to start pulling in people before we go from implementation specific to extended. We need to get people together and say, yeah, I agree, I can run these tests. So
I think it's pretty, as Flynn said, like path redirect is pretty basic. Not sure about gateway API implementations, but like even before. Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, in my head. So
Well,
anyway, so that
good discussion. Good thing to bring up at the next Gateway API meeting.
yeah, put it on the agenda. Perfect point. Put it on the agenda for Monday.
I mean,
That's a
I'll
good
put
one
it,
to
but
talk about.
you'd need to take it from there. Probably I would be able to attend as it's not going to be email.
I can do that. Yes, I can do that on your behalf. I can kind of bring it to the table for you if you'd like. So please do put it on the agenda and put our names on it, and I'll know to take that one on.
All right.
So what Lior is talking about goes directly into conformance, where this is all the tests basically that somebody can run this test suite.
So
it's
so
a
so
little.
let me poke a little bit at this. Here's the
Yeah.
test suite. How might a hypothetical person interested in contributing to the Gateway API actually run these conformance tests? And I'm I am being slightly facetious here, but I'm only being slightly facetious because I tried this recently and literally could not get this to work. And that seems odd because I'm pretty confident this runs in CI all the time, right?
Yeah. Well, so I have a little bit of a bias. I don't use the CLI.
Okay.
In the 2 projects that I help that I maintain, we just use it as Go library, and I can show you one of those.
So you literally have some other repo that just imports all this stuff and runs it.
Yep. So, and I'm sorry for that bias because it's not really fair to the question or anything, but that is, I don't mess with the CLI, but Under in the Kubernetes ingress controller for Kong, we have tests, conformance tests, and basically you can find, I think it's in here. It's been a minute since I've been in here, but
until you find it, I can elaborate on the original question if it's okay. But yeah, recently just explained how to run it with the CLI as well. So basically, you just need to do the you need to have a cluster. What do you want to do you want it to test it against your implementation? So you do it you better do it with the Go library and integrate it in CI. But if you just want to start experiment it, so you're essentially gonna run the tests as Go tests with some parameters while you are in the Gateway API fork. So I can elaborate it later if we have time, or even offline. But yeah, it's essentially with Go
We
tests.
just need kube config in kube context set, and that's it.
What I ended up doing was actually looking at the makefile targets that seemed to be relevant for this and reading some of the CI stuff and figuring out from there, oh, I get it. I need to actually be running this with a particular implementation, et cetera, et cetera. And from that actually still didn't really work. What I ended up doing was switching over to my Envoy Gateway clone and effectively trying to use that, which has integrated the tests as a Go library. That had some other weirdnesses that I am talking to the Envoy Gateway people about.
If you're talking about if you're talking about developing tests just to test it, not against specific, not against your implementations, to use it. So let's say you want to contribute a test. So there is in Envoy Gateway, they actually do it with kind and meta LB, which is fairly simple, and you can do it locally as well without a real Kubernetes cluster.
I'm actually okay with using Envoy Gateway as as a vehicle because I'm involved with that project as well. And like I said, I have to go and talk to some of those folks about places where it looked like I was seeing tests fail. But there are two things that I think are relevant here. One is, well, yeah, we probably should have a README in the conformance directory. And I would volunteer to write that, except for the fact that I didn't actually get it working. So maybe I'll get it working and then volunteer to write it. And the other thing that comes to mind is I kind of wonder if we could, this is probably a political landmine, but I wonder if we could have a reference implementation for the purpose of conformance tests.
We do. That's I'll be getting to that. That's
Carry on.
Inbound. Yeah, that's inbound because of this kind of problem.
Okay, so that may just be a question of time and writing it down someplace. So
yeah, but the README for sure. Yeah, sorry about the README not being.
And Shane, happy to talk about this offline and see how I can help drive some of this forward. Obviously.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So just to give you an idea of what ours is doing, there's a lot of stuff in here, but basically, long and short, we have a test harness that allows you to take add-ons and apply them to a Kubernetes cluster. So we just say we want MetalLB and Kong. We build the environment, and then I think it's just build. Yeah, we build the environment, which then creates a kind cluster, drops these add-ons into it, and then ultimately back over here, we feed that to suite, which in this case is actually the gateway conformance utils suite. And we say, here's our client, which points to that cluster we just created. Here's our gateway class name, so you know what controller we belong to. And then all the other features. This one's kind of interesting. This one's actually going to change a lot or has already changed in a branch somewhere, but basically you can see here the extended, we skip some tests right now. This will be different when conformance profiles is done, but we skip extended tests that we don't actually do. And then experimental conformance that we don't care about yet. We actually technically have one thing that's standard and core that is in here, but this is actually fixed. But just to give you an idea of what the kind of things you can do with this test suite, you can configure everything, run it, run the setup actually, which deploys gateways and stuff. I wish this, there's some rules under which GitHub's code reviewer can send you to the thing, but I don't think it can do it with libraries and stuff. I don't know. I don't spend much time in this thing. I'm usually in Vim. And then ultimately run the test suite and get the result. In the future, that will have potential reporting added to it. So yeah, sorry that it's not the greatest experience. I will be happy to catch up with you afterwards as well to try to help and to shorten the time from now until when you get something working. So please, let's do that though. But because we have a little over 10 minutes, and I do want to get to a couple of the floating topics that I've been pushing back on. Let's keep moving. There's some stuff in here for like container builds. There's documentation, examples of resources. GEPs, this is our gateway enhancement proposals. They're kind of like KEPs if you're familiar with them, and if you're not, it's markdown documents that propose things. So this is where you come propose new major things that would go into the API or changes or what have you. Hack is just full of scripts and stuff.
There
Yeah,
is a
right.
specific reason why we don't use KEPs.
KEPs? Process is too heavy.
Yeah.
We don't want the heavy process. We want a lightweight process. GEP is a lighter weight version of KEP. It's you can
GEPs also tend to get attention from people who are more focused on the gateway API.
Yeah.
So if they are if you're talking about something where the only change you want to make is within the gateway API, then that can happen solely with review from people working on gateway API. The moment you start needing to change something in Kubernetes itself, you're back in KEP land. Yeah.
Package is full of some like Go client library stuff. Site source, I think, is just like where the actual like HTML for the site is emitted. And tools, I don't remember what we put in here. Oh. Okay. Well.
Okay.
I don't know. So that one exists. That one exists. But anyway, so yeah, that's kind of the long and short of what's going on in the code base. But let's round it up real quick. Let's collect ourselves. This is for the most part just the API and the tests. The implementations have to plug into this, or this is nothing. It doesn't do anything. Want to make that abundantly clear, because that's important to one of the main reasons why we're even having this agenda topic today, which is, I would imagine, Daman and Abisman, you both have like potentially an interest in contributing, which we appreciate. It's kind of hard to contribute. Okay, it's nearly impossible to contribute without an implementation that you're also kind of working with. So this has been a problem for a while, I guess I should say. Let's go back to contributing here. I always lose it, but there's an implementation page.
It's been a problem from since the beginning, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's like, okay, so the parallel to this, if you will, is that Kubernetes technically has the Nginx ingress controller, right, which implements ingress. Has a reference implementation. It was for a long time. I think it might still be the most popular overall implementation of ingress. We don't have that. We don't really want that.
The Nginx ingress controller also doesn't have that because it is no longer maintained.
Yeah.
There's the other one that F5 is maintaining, but I don't think it's got the traction. So that's a really interesting situation for the ingress resource.
Yeah, I think saying it's not maintained is a little. It's not wrong. It's not wrong, but it's a little wrong in that there's still a regular meeting for it that people do show up to when agenda is present. So it's very on the edge.
So it's not wrong, but it's not right.
Correct. It's very on the edge. Anyway, suffice to say, that was just to point out that like we took a different approach intentionally here by not having a reference implementation or a default implementation, because that is a maintenance nightmare. To be supporting a production, not only the API, but the production implementation of the API that people are using from the perspective of volunteers working on an open source community-led project is nightmarish. Doing the API, however, and then letting people implement that how they need for their customers works pretty well. But from your perspective as somebody who wants to get involved, it's a little difficult to know where to start, because you literally have to kind of attach yourself to an implementation. So I am always very careful to not provide biases if I can avoid it. I obviously have biases, but go through this list, find the one that speaks to you, is basically what I tell people, more or less. Like find like whatever, because I obviously have no bias here. Like if you've worked with HA proxy before, go there, do that kind of thing. Make a decision for what's best for you in terms of getting attached to it, an implementation. We do, on the other hand, technically have an upcoming, because of this problem, we have an upcoming project which is currently at Kong, disclaimer, but being and there's a discussion for this, being donated to the CNCF called Blixt. And I'd like to talk about it just for a minute, but it is an implementation of Gateway API that only does L4. So here's the whole thing if you're interested in basically us moving to the CNCF. It's an L4 only, so TCP route and UDP route. Implementation of Gateway API, only uses Gateway API for the API. And it is using eBPF for the data plane. Sorry, Damon. And the intention with this originally, so at Kong, this just started as pure experiment. This thing had a big logo on it that said just, it still has something like that, but it originally started with just we're not using it for anything. We're just playing with it. As we're donating it, what we decided in Gateway API, that is the maintainers decided, is that this would be a good tool to provide a reference implementation if it never ends up in production. So that is our current intention, is for this to be a never in production reference implementation that can give you some of the implicate, like how you would run the test suite, how a gateway controller might work. So like how you actually deploy the gateway. So like we have one here. Our gateways are a little funny because they're basically just a service that we hijacked today, but it'll, anyway. So,
so do you think that would preclude including layer 7, or do you think?
No, the question of layer 7 remains open, but the important part is that this implementation, the rules that we had for whether we would finally have a reference implementation it can't be it cannot step on anybody's toes or be like, technically Envoy is CNCF, but we made the decision that we would not use Envoy because there's kind of I don't know if this is the right word, but kind of a tribalism to that, right? It kind of plays a favorite if we do that. We don't want to do that.
At minimum, it's a conflict of interest.
Yeah, at minimum, it's a conflict of interest. So our data plane is Linux. No conflict of interest. Everybody's happy with Linux being the data plane. And then the control plane is Gateway API. So this worked for us. We could have made, there probably some other things we could have chosen, but eBPF was fun at the time too. And this has been this project has been around to be fun as well. There was a certain amount of spirit of like just kind of building something fun together that went into this project. Let me just riff on this a little bit more.
We'll just backport it to IP tables and rip out the.
Yeah, you could. But that was another option, but we felt eBPF was more fun. So the intention is never in production. We literally talked about having a kill switch that would like shut it down over time and say, nope, you cannot run this in production. Don't you dare. Yep. And then it's meant to also be the first, like we don't because of this problem of like implementations kind of having to be these third-party things. We've never had on PRs where like the CI actually runs the conformance tests. We always have to wait for feedback from people going off and trying them, and this has happened quite a bit, we produce some conformance tests because they don't run actually when we merge the PR, have broken the conformance test. So this is supposed to help a little bit with that. And if we can get a layer 7 option that is not a conflict of interest, then we could potentially do that for that too. But again, so this is kind of our answer to, we want people to be able to jump in and like help with something. We'd never want it in production. And we want to kind of like be able to provide a reference for people, and we want to run something in CI. This came together at all those things. Big caveat, I would say, because I am basically saying, please do feel free to come and join this project, is feel free to wait until this is actually ported over to Kubernetes SIGs. There's been a long wait because the CNCF has apparently, I don't know, they're Linux Foundation. They're founded on Linux, but they've had problems with GPL. I don't really understand that, but the GPL has been a problem. No, GPL has been an issue.
We can talk a little bit more about that offline. It's I ended up having to talk with an open source, a colleague of mine who is also really, really rabidly pro open source. And so we ended up talking about this at one point, and it's kind of an interesting story that is both really confusing and also ends up making a fair amount of sense. So yeah.
Okay, I'd be interested to hear the story, because I currently am just waiting and watching and kind of wondering, like, I don't know what's going to go on.
It does make me wonder a lot about, so yeah, to Dan's point, I know for a fact that this is impacting Istio and Cilium and Blixt you know,
Yep.
at least
Liz Rice just pointed it out actually in the thread. She recently said, "Hey, you got like 5 or 6 projects held up on this right now."
Well, I mean, it's, as I understand it, it is the thing that is in the way of Istio and Cilium being able to graduate, for example. And
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to have fewer graduated service meshes, wearing my buoyant hat, but
She said.
yeah, this needs to be dealt with. It's a problem.
Yep, absolutely. So the GPL is, this will eventually, my expectation is this will eventually finally get dealt with. It just takes some time to do anything legal. And
Yeah.
then GPL V2, by the way, which is the not so spicy one, should be allowed. So
one thing I wanted to call out as well is, like, it depends if you want to contribute to, like, just, you know, more conformance tests. So you'd probably want to choose an implementation that it's more, you know, that have more features.
yes,
Well, in particular, you'd need to pick an L7 implementation right now,
Yes.
right?
Today you'd have to, I would not, if you want to focus on L7, don't touch this yet. You want to
Yeah.
help get it to L7? That'd be cool.
Yeah.
That's different. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
different. But
Yeah.
if you go pick a different implementation, if you want to work on L7,
Yeah.
if you just want to kind of start messing with the waters, this might be a good place. I totally understand for people that want to wait until it's actually migrated to the Kubernetes SIGs org. But yeah, it's a good point. And I definitely encourage you to go find, like I said, the main thing I would say is find the one that speaks to you, like something you've used before or you're using currently that speaks to you. Because there's all of these. There are so many options.
But Shane, are you talking about contributing to those projects or contributing to the gateway API itself? That's what I don't understand.
Potentially both.
I think.
Like, I mean, if you're using Contour in production right now, you're interested in Gateway API and you want to contribute to Gateway API, why shouldn't you go into, again, I'm using this as an unbiased example. I don't work on Contour at all.
Yeah.
You know, like, why shouldn't you get involved there? But that's the best way for you to contribute to the Gateway API is if you can connect yourself with an implementation.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And as a specific, sorry, go ahead, Lior.
I was just small question. Do you maintain a backlog of like open issues and Blixt, or like, you know, probably, I see.
Yep. And this meeting actually started as the Blixt meeting.
Yeah.
Which is why, like I said, most of the time, like last week when we were on, there was probably 4 or 5 of us on here last week. Oh yeah, I think Victor was here too. And he was like, what are you guys doing? Because Victor's kind of new to the community, but we were literally like pair coding Rusty BPF code live, like on Blixt to get some stuff done in there. We recently just got the TCP support added. We've had UDP support for a while. We recently got TCP support added. So, and like I said, there's a branch where I'm getting the layer 4 conformance tests in Gateway API kind of, they're partially done basically. But I need to get back to that. So that hopefully that rounded off a lot of the things I was trying to get to, but the most important one was where and how can I even contribute? Because it's not like there's an Nginx ingress controller for this thing. There kind of is, but we're being extremely guarded about that, if that makes sense.
But you know, the point about the existing implementations and such does make a lot of sense. It's certainly handy for me to know that, yeah, the official supported sanctioned way would be pick something like, in my case, it'll probably be Envoy Gateway, use that as the mechanism to test a conformance test, but put the conformance test into the Gateway API.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And just in case anybody is watching this later, my previous wisecrack about it being to my benefit to have fewer graduated service meshes was a joke. Actually, you know, having the other things graduated is not at all a bad thing. Let me be clear about that.
Yeah. We are at time, but we've also said a ton of things, and I personally have time. Like, please go if you need to go. Don't feel held up. If you'd like to stick around and just ask questions from here until the end, please do. I'll wait until everybody's left, more or less.
I just wanted to call out as well that like there are also like more opportunities to contribute, like ingress to gateway, for example. I assume that once gateway API goes to V1, so a lot of people will want some conversion between ingress to gateway. Right?
Sorry, I think somebody, one more time.
Isn't somebody actually working on an ingress to gateway translation?
Sorry, we have ingress to gateway in
Well,
Kubernetes 6.
I was saying that once we go to V1, so then we probably expect more people to onboard, and it'd be much easier if they have some kind of automated conversion, and
Yep,
from ingress.
we have it. It needs help. Like it needs
Yeah.
more contributors. So it's actually right now it is Rob, myself, and I think Sanjay are the technically considered the maintainers. Anyway, but it exists. It's in Kubernetes 6. We did in the talk that, I won't forget. I need to share a talk with you, Abisman. But the in the talk,
Actually, I think
mentioned it.
Lyra posted that early
I
on.
shared your link already. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. So yeah, in that talk, we refer to this project. It works in a very basic case. Like I don't know what to say except that it works in the basic case. We need people who have like real implementations with lots of, like, we need people who have like annotations all over the place to come in and help us like map out annotations potentially. That's something we're open to adding. But like the basic case of like a simple ingress to gateway works today. But it will need more love from the community to get to the point where it's able to do some of the more complex things with like, I don't know, specific implementations, annotations, and stuff like that.
I was wondering if Gen AI can help here.
Yeah, meeting is over. End meeting. No, I mean you can try it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've left that boogeyman alone for the time being. I'm just kind of watching from the sidelines. All
of the generative AI stuff is really nice for giving an expert a starting point and really terrible for being very confident when it is wrong.
Yeah.
So
I see that, but I see a future that we don't do anything like what we're doing today. So the future that I see, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but is that AI is kind of silly how it's being used today because this is opinion. Sorry. My opinion is AI being used in the current way to generate code is a little silly because it's basically saying we have all this junk we don't want to write. Let's just automate that. What I think is going to happen as like an evolution of this is an eventual future where compilers and languages actually have more AI at the lower levels baked into them so that the languages become more expressive. So it's not so much I'm just automating the junk, but it's that the junk isn't really there because the language is more expressive. That's the future I'm hoping for with AI, that I will
be. Did you see the movie Amadeus?
No.
There are a couple of scenes in there where Mozart is working with Salieri, and it's an interesting parallel to some of the stuff you're talking about, right? Where instead of saying things like, okay, do an A here and then do this note here and this note here, he's kind of going like, oh, and then I hear this transition and this chord and this, can you hear this? And Salieri's like, oh yeah, and starts writing it out, right?
I haven't seen that. No,
that would be an interesting future for sure.
Yeah. I think we're probably going to get something more like that. I'm sure it will never be exactly what's in my head, but something more like that where the languages just become way more expressive because of AI. The syntax and everything is influenced by it. So, but anyway, we've got digression to the. I'm sorry, I can go off on a digression like you wouldn't believe. Do we have questions that are relevant to gateway and stuff like that?
I have one question.
Yeah.
So you said that Ingress and API Gateway, they're being kept as separate projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this project showed it right now on the screen, that Ingress to Gateway. So isn't that making Ingress more like Gateway, making Ingress more Gateway conformant?
It's allowing a path from Ingress to Gateway. If you having Ingress be more gateway conformant, to me, the wording that you've used sounds like we're trying to make sure that the things that like come out of Ingress to Gateway are functionally working. And I think they would be. Like, I think that I'm having a little bit of trouble kind of getting at the point of the question, but if the question is, should Ingress resources today be conformant as they're converted to Gateway API resources with something like Ingress to Gateway? Yes. Like that everything should just work. Is there room for some error where like something doesn't quite work the same way? That is kind of up to the implementations. The implementations could definitely mess that up. Like there could be subtle differences in their implementation of HTTP route versus ingress that cause things that are converted to actually do something different. And these are things that maybe we need to be better about looking out for, if that was your point. Is that your point?
I guess like sort of.
Okay.
I think part of the point of the gateway API is, excuse me, I think part of the point of the gateway API itself is trying to deal with some of the complexities in interpreting what exactly ingress is supposed to mean, given all the annotations that proliferated on the ingress resource. So in a lot of ways, the point of the gateway API was acknowledging that the ingress resource wasn't really working out and trying to come up with something better. So to that, given that background, I think it makes an enormous amount of sense to give people a path to migrate off of ingress onto something that is structured and less flexible, or not less flexible, structured and less subject to random interpretation. How about that?
That's fair.
But I don't think that Gateway API intends to ever interact directly with the ingress resource. Yeah.
Right. And I guess since we're recording this, this might be the point in the video where somebody is freaking out.
We're also not saying that we're expecting to kill the ingress resource.
No,
ingress
ingress will be around
for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it'll be around for a long time. It just won't be getting new features. So I probably should have said that way earlier on, considering we're being recorded. But yeah, ingress, we say that in the talk too. It'll be around a long time. It's just, it's good. It's okay for what it does now. We're leaving it there. Next steps are all in Gateway API resources.
It can be used in a way that is not okay for its current functionality. How about that?
Yeah,
I'm happy
if you're
with
previously using it, you don't need to rush to upgrade or migrate or anything like that. But if you are not previously using ingress, probably start with Gateway API, not ingress. Yeah, don't use ingress. Avoid it.
Yeah.
So one more
Other
question.
questions? Yeah, go for it.
So what I'm able to understand is that Gateway API is more like a specification, which implementations must
absolutely
adhere to.
Yeah.
And then
that's what we were trying to emphasize when we were walking through the code base. That code base, just the API specification and tests, not the implementation. Yeah, you got it. Yep, it's a specification, and that's why it's a little hard to contribute to it, but we love to have contributors. So please do reach out to me personally. I'm at Shane in Kubernetes Slack, and then just I generally think it's better to post in the Gateway API channel, but if you're not comfortable with that, PM me. Because you'll get a lot more people and I'm not always online and whatnot. But the
really
the help is there. Online? As a matter of fact, although with the advent of ChatGPT, I may be able to be online constantly soon. We'll see if I can create a Shane bot. No, so yeah, so please do reach out. You know, if you're getting stuck, don't let yourself feel stuck. We reach out to the community. There's so many people. It's such a big group. It is the biggest sub project in Kubernetes under a SIG that I'm aware of in terms of sheer number of contributors and like active people on syncs and stuff like that. It's close. It's one of the top ones. And then personally speaking, it's the most intense open source thing. As a maintainer, I have come to an appreciation of just how busy we are. So
you can also reach out to me on Slack. I'm at Flynn on pretty much all the Slacks in the world, as far as I can tell, based on how many show up in my Slack app. But yeah. And pretty much everything Shane just said applies to me as well. Happy to hear from people and help out if I can. And I am also not always online, although there are people who won't believe that.
Yeah, same here. Also, like Flynn or Shade, if you need some help with the CLI with conformance or documentation. So
yeah, I'll likely. Are you Lior, or is your Slack handle more complex than that?
Yeah, like first name, last name. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not complex.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you were working on Envoy Gateway actually. So that's kind of.
I'm not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just stealing the make files.
I'll tell Luke you said that, and
Just
but,
stealing the make files.
Yeah.
their make
like,
files are not terrible. I think that's probably
no,
okay.
they're good,
I
yeah.
wasn't necessarily inferring that. I think it's actually funny stealing the make files, because make files usually end up becoming so very, very project specific, is just interesting. It's like,
I mean, they run their CI for the conformance on MetaLB and kind, and it's a very, very lean and like
that's what we do.
yeah,
It's
very
Envoy Gateway is, as Ingress controllers go, Envoy Gateway is still very straightforward and lightweight, mostly because it doesn't do a whole lot. So its build system is straightforward. And the people who wrote its build system, I think the most polite way of saying it is learned a lot from the horror that is Emissary's build system and did things differently. So it would be nice to steal some of that stuff back for Emissary, but there are reasons why it's harder for Emissary as well. But end result, if you're doing something vaguely like Envoy Gateway in terms of trying to run the conformance tests, it actually is a pretty straightforward makefile setup. Also, there's a long history of stealing makefiles rather than writing them from scratch. I mean, dude, we did that back in the 90s,
So I
I
just
don't-
realized too, I took the opportunity just because it was convenient for me, because it was something I knew, to show like the Kong ingress controller. And
Mhm.
Lior is talking about gateway operator, or sorry, Envoy Gateway. Feel free to make your pitches for your own things. Like I didn't really do a pitch, but like open door, if you want to say, hey, I'm working on this project, we'd love to have you join us. That's fine. This is
No,
recorded.
no,
I mean,
I'm not working on any implementation. I'm just contributing to some gateway like conformance tests. So yeah, I'm working
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't have any implementation. I work in Google. I work in like the GC, the Google Compute Engine. I even don't work. Funnily
Gotcha.
enough, I was working on Kubernetes more before I joined Google. But
Okay.
We should
But
have a
yeah.
discussion about that.
But yeah, I was just commenting like because you were mentioning that you didn't succeed with a CLI, so if you need any help there or any like help for the documentation.
Yeah, I'll very likely take you up on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Um, In the meantime, you should go tell Google they have all this cash. They should be spending more of it on Kubernetes. I mean, come on.
Yes, please. Please more for Kubernetes, which everyone is using.
Right.
All right.
Exactly.
So I guess we're about 15 minutes over. We probably should wrap it up. Thank you for all the questions. Please do reach out in Slack and stuff like that. I hope this was very helpful for you. And again, if it wasn't, please reach out in Slack. Feel free to be like, man, that really wasn't that helpful. Could you help me with these things? Yeah, so this is a good one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.